another convivial, comradely, creative, dynamic, and politically committed meeting. So I am going to quickly give thanks, first of all, to Diana. We would not be able to sit here without Diana. We'll give the thanks again, don't worry, Diana was right. We went, who I think is running around, and Leon and Daniel, there's Daniel walking in, are my amazing students here at Binghamton University. I know Andy has been, this is his third World-Ecology meeting, so he is a true veteran. I also want to thank Hannah Cotton and Marion Dixon for organizing Commodity Frontiers panels, actually, but they had to be shifted around because we had some last-minute cancellations. To Martin Arboleda for organizing a fantastic panel on planetary urbanization and the war against the peasantry. Alejandro de Casa put together a panel as well, so I want to thank, this is truly a collective effort, an ongoing collaboration. World ecology is not a theory, it's not a line, it's a conversation, and we're going to stick to that. We're going to give up our academic turf, and we're going to try to come together to enjoy and nurture a revolutionary intellectual state shift. So, today I want to introduce, boy, it's so exciting to be able to introduce these two dynamic scholars. Sarah Knuth is going to talk about financialization and defensive urbanism in climate-vulnerable world cities. It's hard to imagine a more timely and relevant topic. She is joining the faculty of Durham University. Truly a dynamic geography department this fall. Very well deserved. Always wonderful when good people get good jobs. Yeah, and people have been getting jobs, believe it or not. I'm going to alert everyone to Christian Parenti joining the economics. Yes, economics department at John Jay, where he's now associate professor of economics, sure to be up to full, and they're launching a very dynamic, heterodox master's program in economics, which is sure to be quite useful. So if you have undergrads who are doing that, please encourage them to look into that. And then Wendy Lin-Lee from Bloomsbury University. I want to alert everyone to this, what looks to be an extremely exciting book. She just gave me a copy, and I'm going to be sitting down with it, not during your talk, Wendy, though. You have my full attention then. So, and I want to alert everyone to PM Press, who has been very supportive of World Ecology. PM Press is publishing the new annual World Ecology Journal, peer-reviewed, in print, online, and so we'll be talking to people about that. And they publish a seemingly endless stream of high-quality, provocative, politically committed books. So check them out, support them, and without further ado, Sarah Knuth. All right.
Normally I have pictures, so my apologies. Thanks so much to Jason and Diana and everybody. It's really exciting to be here, and I'm so excited to be first so I can get it over quickly. But so I'll get started. So as we attempt to theorize and respond to the world ecological crisis unfolding today, we face a political challenge and a host of conceptual ones. Thanks to capitalism's global reach and pervasiveness, historically and today, in many ways, we are not dealing with one world ecological crisis, but multiple. Long histories of resource appropriation and degradation can drive socio-ecological collapses, and so can destabilization of the global climate system caused by fossil capitalism. But the two don't necessarily do so in the same way, nor in the same places. And that's true even if systems feel the effects of both simultaneously, as is happening increasingly. Moreover, how systems are vulnerable to environmental change varies. Many realizations of ecological degradation and destabilization will hurt the already exploited and vulnerable. Few will threaten the successful reproduction of capitalism itself. At the same time, capitalism's own points of structural weakness are not fixed in nature or time or space, but are themselves evolving within a turbulent system. So to speak effectively to the political moment, we have to think synthetically, and we have to think tactically. And one of our tasks must be to ask what forms of environmental disturbance in what kinds of places do truly threaten capital. So I'd like to suggest one candidate for this role at the center of contemporary capitalism, which is financial centers and other world cities where they are exposed to acute climate threats. So this potential vulnerability may seem paradoxical. Many here encounter these centers chiefly as colonizers and creators of vulnerability elsewhere. Moreover, in today's financialized capitalism, capitalism's commanding heights should, in theory, have their run of the entire globe and be ever more removed from dependence on any particular place. If hurricanes or floods decimate one city and radically devalue the fixed capital embedded in it, a footloose capitalism should easily be able to replace it with substitute places and substitute investments. I argue that in practice, however, global capitalism remains dependent on special places, places that cannot be so easily replaced. And this is particularly true in a period of economic turbulence, one that seems unlikely to end anytime soon. So we're beginning to see the evidence emerging in this, in emerging forms of defensive urbanism, to borrow Mike Davis's term, among other folks who've used it, related to climate change. So strategic rethinking that's beginning to change how events like, say, Hurricane Sandy in New York are being perceived as a threat. So when we're talking about climate change, its main mode as a threat is systemic destabilization, I would argue. It's caused in some places, but felt unpredictably in many other places around the world. And this materiality produces endemic uncertainties and endemic indeterminacies, more than we can ever adequately model and develop planned responses to. But the most generalizable and obvious consensus is that already vulnerable human and non-human natures will be most vulnerable to this new turbulence, with those in particularly exposed places merely all the worse off. So recent critical scholarship on climate change has noted a deepening financialization of this problem, as insurance companies and financial institutions begin to take up climate change as a strategic question and a speculative frontier for accumulation. Scholars like Lee Johnson are tracking these institutions' experimentation with products such as weather index insurance and derivatives, agricultural microfinance, and other instruments marketed as security against climate change's unique forms of risk, but equally capable of creating new risks and new forms of vulnerability. If they do fail, many of these experiments are likely to hurt the laboring poor far more than they hurt global capitalism. Much of this aforementioned work has focused primarily on how insurance companies and financial institutions self-financialize notions of resilience to others, capital O strongly implied here. However, climate change's unusual environmental geography means that it is equally capable of striking at capitalism's centers in unprecedented ways. World cities are a particularly apt example. They're places that play key functional roles in capitalism's expanded reproduction. So, for example, the roles played by New York and by Silicon Valley in US and world capitalism have proven difficult to replicate, although competitors continue to try and will continue to try. So this seeming indispensability for the foreseeable future has helped make these places key repositories of stored value for global capital. So as post-crisis research on transnational real estate investment and wealth piggy banking in New York and London and San Francisco and other places has shown. So as we take on what climate change may mean for these places, it's therefore critical that we pay more attention to how insurance companies and other financial actors and their like frame climate risk, not just for vulnerable others, who certainly inhabit these places as well, but internally for themselves. So for example, insurance companies have long held commercial real estate in world cities, maintaining real property assets on their books as long-term investments. Today's financialization of property in instruments such as real estate investment trusts, REITs, for example, and an urgent search for yield have prompted more institutional investors to consider these alternative forms of investment, sinking new capital into real estate and infrastructure. Meanwhile, capital flight continues to swell the value of real estate in New York and London and other safe world cities. So I argue that this prominence of real property, tangible things, in investors' search for security today is shaping new conversations about climate risks in world cities. So for example, it's evident in new preoccupations with REIT vulnerability in major weather events. So REIT's investment, which is going to be mostly things like commercial property, so office towers are something I'll talk a lot about here, but it can be a lot of other commercial property too. So this REIT investment ballooned in the United States in the immediate wake, relatively immediate wake of the 2008 financial collapse, demonstrating just how difficult it is to discipline the financialization of property. So REIT's concentration in cities like New York meant that when Hurricane Sandy hit the city, financial reporting had a new kind of risk to worry about: mass devaluation of major investors' capital in a potentially uninsurable way. Beyond familiar warnings of human costs and risks of property loss for many, the event was posed as a distinct threat to finance and major investors. So headlines appeared like 9,000 REIT-owned properties in Hurricane Sandy's path, and more than 1,600 REIT-owned properties in hurricane-ravaged New York City metro area. And commentators focus not only on Sandy's billions of dollars of damage. We've become pretty used to hearing about those kind of damage figures for hurricane events, but what big investors were exposed, what big investors owned the property affected. So it was an object lesson in how a climate disaster might be transmuted into a financial one. More recent US hitting hurricanes like Hurricane Andrew and Hurricane Matthew have repeated this new trend, with a distinct investor's threat emerging against the broader socio-ecological one. So for example, one financial mouthpiece warned in October that any substantial fallout from Hurricane Matthew could lead investors to revalue REITs or even dampen investor sentiment towards the REIT sector. So behind the finance speak, that's a big deal. These discourses pose critical policy implications for the just allocation of resources in urban resilience planning, a topic that will demand ongoing attention. However, they also illuminate a significant paradox that demands more attention here. Capitalism has historically been willing to abandon its existing centers in search of new ones. Not only its Detroits, but also financial centers, such as New York City in the 1970s. And financialization theoretically allows capital even greater detachment from place-based vulnerability. However, has it actually made the system more reliant on the defense of particular cities and their property values? I think we have to examine this question if we want to look at the real vulnerability of capitalism to climate change. So in the contemporary moment, we're therefore forced to confront an old question in new forms. If capitalism is so powerful in the world today, such a profound colonizing force across so many places and so many spheres, how at the same time has it remained so brittle and so crisis-prone? I suggest that today's moment within global capitalism is marked by systemic defensiveness. The experience of many places in the years since the late 2000s financial collapse has been a wave of neo-colonial land and resource grabs, including in new realms like green capitalism, so-called. Many have been enabled by the ongoing financialization of property, including forms of property that transnational investors wouldn't have touched before, like farmland in developing countries, and which is actually one empirically demonstrable form of planetary urbanization, as investors adapted urban real estate investments like REITs for rural land and resources. So for many, this seemed evident that capital had managed to shift the cost of the crisis onto the vulnerable and come out as powerful as ever. And that is true, but only up to a point. The view of financial stability from within capitalism's centers of power is considerably less certain. Financialization may be opening up new speculative frontiers, but it is unclear whether new forms of extraction and exploitation will actually restore accumulation and stability of the financial system. Major financial institutions in the United States and beyond, and international system regulators such as the International Monetary Fund, US Federal Reserve, Bank of International Settlements, have been rocked by repeated shocks since 2008, made no less serious by their ability to displace this pain onto the less powerful. Prominent economists speaking to these institutions' challenges have produced a surprisingly anxious debate for economists, present company accepted, about safe assets in today's financial system, i.e. forms of property capable of holding value in a crisis. Some question whether any assets are truly safe today, and most warn that the financial system does not have enough of these safe assets to secure the system when the next crisis hits. So fundamentally, an important wellspring of international economic turbulence today, then, is how will financialized capitalism seek safety in a crisis, and the contradictions of its strategies. The aftermath of the Great Depression was geopolitical catastrophe, mass devaluation, and eventually major disciplining and restructuring of the financial system under Keynesianism. The wake of the Great Recession so far has been a system re-regulated, we'll see, to respond to some of the specific abuses of the subprime bubble, but in its essence unchanged. Massive too-big-to-fail banks and institutional investors continue to occupy the commanding heights of global capitalism, and they face many of the same dilemmas that produced the subprime crisis in the first place. So as Bob Brenner and others have argued, banks' turn to ever more risky investments in the subprime bubble was not simply hubris, blind faith that complex financial engineering had successfully disciplined and domesticated risk, or even self-interested greed, although it was both. It was also a strategy compelled paradoxically by banks' own past successes. So as many in this room argue, capitalism habitually appropriates non-human nature and human labor without concern for the successful reproduction of either. Meanwhile, finance has become increasingly expert at cannibalizing capitalism itself in new ways. In the late 2000s, banks seized on long stable institutions produced in an earlier capitalist era, converted them into instruments of surplus extraction, and damaged them perhaps fatally in the process. So it did this to a wide range of institutions: US mortgage finance, manufacturing corporations, urban debt. But when finance has killed its golden geese, where is it to turn afterwards? So certain kinds of financial institutions like hedge funds are expert in turning crises into opportunities for even more successful cannibalization and in exploiting risky new opportunities, investments in, say, farmland across the world. However, bread and butter institutions like pension funds and insurers that actually hold much of the world's capital have no such ability. They're compelled to take a longer-term view and keep the capital they hold accumulating in safe ways, they hope, into the future. So even as institutions like insurers promise safety to millions of everyday people, including in new products aimed at reducing vulnerability to climate change, it's by no means clear that they'll be able to keep themselves safe. Institutional investors are caught in a real dilemma. They can't risk their assets on overly risky investments, but recent crises have actually wiped out many existing safe assets without producing new ones. So in this context, it's hardly surprising to see so many investors from the United States and abroad pile capital into real estate in world cities like New York. This capital flight to real estate merely expands Peter Gowan's concept of the dollar Wall Street regime, that more frequent financial crises strengthen financial centers, even if financial centers cause these crises. So in times of economic turbulence, many investors are forced to flee to safety, even if that response ultimately makes the whole system more brittle and vulnerable. So I suggest that it's precisely this dynamic that makes climate change such an unusually powerful threat to places like New York in the ways that I've discussed. Not every world city or store of value for capitalism is particularly exposed to climate hazards like sea level rise and increasingly severe and frequent hurricanes. However, for those that are, the potential for sudden devaluation events poses a real threat in the current moment. If capitalism were to take heavy damage in a center like New York in the near future, it's not clear how it would replace it. So to conclude, the story that I tell here is only one face of contemporary world ecological crisis, and one instance in which newly unruly natures and physical turbulence might compromise the successful reproduction of capitalism itself. The example here is most striking in its specificity. It requires a capitalism made particularly vulnerable to economic crisis, by economic crisis to seek safety in particular places. It then requires one or more of these places to have very bad luck with an unpredictable weather event, one that can cause a large property devaluation and significantly impair its functioning. Although this kind of crisis inevitably has roots in capitalism's longue durée, it is shaped most importantly by conjunctural events and how acute climate events matter in such conjunctures. But we need these kind of understandings. Taking on the multiple ways in which capitalist ecological crisis is expressed is a critical step towards developing more strategic and just responses. Thanks very much.